know this is a bit of a theme, a bit of a thing that you like, but I think we have an aircraft story.
I know it. Even I'm getting bored with aircraft stories, and I'm sure our listeners are going, tell me one about ships or something. And the idea is to challenge people's design assumptions. Think aircraft made of wood and wire and rope. Makes sense, right?
And the ejector button is just one finger push away.
Really,
right?
really close. On one day, 17 pilots were killed in accidents in one day. Yeah, this is bollocks.
Right.
But how does he prove it? Zip, nada, nothing. Crickets, donuts. Anger dissipates when people are listened to.
Welcome to Anecdotally Speaking, our podcast to help you build your business story repertoire. Hi, everyone. I'm Shawn Callahan.
And hey, everybody, I'm Mark Shank.
No, Mark, I know this is a bit of a theme, a bit of a thing that you like, but I think we have an aircraft story.
I know it. Even I'm getting bored with aircraft stories, and I'm sure our listeners are going, tell me one about ships or something. Maybe I'll go on submarines or something. This is another aircraft story, and was shared. I came across this because our partner in India, Indranil Chakraborty, everyone calls him IC, had shared it on his website, and I saw it and thought, that's a really good story. So here we go.
Thanks, IC.
Right? Yeah, and so this story causes people, and the idea is to challenge people's design assumptions.
Right.
Yeah, so back in the 1920s, manned powered flight was in its infancy. World War I saw the advent of things like the Sopwith Camel and the Fokker triplane, and think aircraft made of wood and wire and rope.
Yeah, right.
That's the era we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So in the early 1920s, they thought, hang on, we need to get our heads around the design of the cockpits. So they did a bunch of measurements and they came up with the average pilot. So here's the average pilot. And that concept, that data was used to inform cockpit design for the next 30 years. Right? Average pilot, average cockpit. So the assumption was that people are average, and therefore the control column needs to be this far away.
Yeah, right.
Makes sense, right?
And the ejector button is just one finger push away.
Really,
right?
really close. Yeah, but not too close.
Not too close. Yeah.
All right. And now we're fast forward to the 1950s, right? The United States Air Force is the most advanced air force in the world. Their pilots are really good, and they're getting better. Their aircraft and the technology in the aircraft is the best in the world and getting better. But the results are getting worse. There's more accidents. I think on one day, 17 pilots were killed in accidents in one day. Yeah. Like it was, this is a serious problem. And so everyone started going, what's to blame? What's to blame? Pointing the finger. Of course, the first thing they did was it must be pilot error. Pilots are the problem. Right. Now that was, the pilots were pretty sure it wasn't them. So, then it must be the technology. The technology is too advanced, and it was an easy explanation. But again, it wasn't true. People started blaming the instructors. Maybe they're not being trained correctly. Anyway, somebody came up with the realization that the cockpit design was based around the data, the research that was done in the 1920s. And of course, things have changed dramatically. Pilots have changed.
So hope so.
So they went, we need to re-baseline. We need to get a new average. And so a study was conducted at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and they studied 4,600 pilots, and they measured them across a plethora of dimensions. And the 10 most important dimensions were selected, right? The 10 that have the biggest influence on cockpit design.
Right.
Height, arm length, length of legs, weight, width of shoulders, or these sorts of things, right? So they picked the 10 most important dimensions, and they used the data from the 4,600 pilots to come up with a new average. And for example, the average height was, say, 5'9".
Yeah.
Now, and the assumption was, well, we're just going to design cockpits around this new average. Well, around that time, a young lieutenant, a graduate from Harvard, turns up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a guy called Lieutenant Gilbert Daniels, and he'd done his study at Harvard, and he'd actually been studying human dimensions,
right?
And his study showed that even in very, very similar ethnic and socioeconomic groups, hand size varied tremendously, and there was no such thing as hand size. So he looked at this data and this new average, and he just said, "This is bollocks."
Right.
But how does he prove it? Well, what he did is he took the data of all 4,603 pilots and went for each dimension. Does the pilot fall within the average or not?
Right.
Now, the assumption from most people was that the vast majority of the 4,603 pilots would be within the average across these 10 dimensions.
Yeah.
In reality, what he showed, he got the data, he put it together, and it showed that of the 4,603 pilots, the percentage that was within the average range across all 10 dimensions was zero. Zip, nada, nothing, crickets, donuts, whatever word you want to use to describe it, not one single pilot fit the average on all 10 of those dimensions.
Right.
He then he went, okay, well, that's, people were really surprised by this.
Oh, and so angry, I bet. Angry, I would say.
Yeah. And he said, well, let's look at the top three. Let's just pick three. And of those 4,000 odd pilots, how many of them fell within the average for just three of those dimensions? Have a think. What do you reckon?
Thinking if it was zero, I'm saying 15%.
Yeah, it was 3.5%.
3% in three out of three.
Just on three dimensions. Anyway, wow. What he did is he proved that there was no such thing as the average pilot.
Right.
And that they've actually got this thing called a jagged profile. Somebody who's tall might be thin. Right? And so you get the idea. And the assumption that it guided cockpit design for that, for those 30 years was thrown away. And the Air Force said, "You're right. Thank goodness." And they basically banned design based on the average pilot. And so they said to the aircraft manufacturers, you need to design to the edges, not to the center. It's a complete, and of course the manufacturers they're going, no, this is impossible.
Right.
And even if it was possible, it'll be way too expensive. But of course, when the Air Force wouldn't budge on this, the manufacturers soon came up with brilliant ideas.
Oh, give them constraints, you see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yes. And things that today we take completely for granted, like adjustable seats on our cars. Right. And not just sliding forwards and backwards, but multiple types of adjustment. All this came from that change, that
observation, that backed by good data.
Yeah. And so I guess in terms of the business point, I think about the importance of this for design, right? Whenever you're designing something, if you design for the average, like if you're designing a product for the average customer, you might in fact be designing it for no one.
There's a sort of a sobering point, isn't it?
A sobering thought.
Yeah. Hey, nice one. Love it. Lots of good twists and turns in that. And, I actually, because I'm sort of really focused on, as you know, sort of, how to present data, using stories. It's a good data story, isn't it? This one.
And I think that for those of you who are planning to undertake the Story Powered Data program in the next few months, you might see this example starting to appear.
It might pop up, absolutely. I'm definitely going to purloin that's for sure. One of the things I love about this story is the fact that it's always at the outsider that, turns things on its head. So in a way, this should be something that you look for when you're in a design process. Like if you've got a whole bunch of people who all work together, do the same thing, do it the same way, been doing it for years, hey, maybe you should invite some people who sit outside your world, right? You know, because that young lieutenant comes along and all of a sudden he sees it from a quite different perspective. That's powerful stuff, right? Isn't it?
Yeah,
You know,
it's
when you
incredible.
see that. I remember when we were doing work years ago in my IBM days, you know, that was one of the, if you like, principles that we would try to seek out in our complexity work was how do you bring someone into the system that was, you know, quite different to everyone else. It was someone who could push you and act as a provocateur. I think that was the actual title we used for that person. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
love that. What do you like about the story? What's things that you
Well,
enjoy telling?
I'll come to that in a second. I just wanted to the source of this story is important, right? It's a book called The End of Average by L. Todd Rose,
Right.
and he's also done a TED talk. So if you just Google Todd Rose average, you're going to find the TED talk.
Yeah.
So that's the source. Now, the things I enjoyed about it was the surprise, like zero. I remember when I first heard this, 0%, you know, like not one single pilot of the 4,603 fell within the normal range across all those 10 dimensions. It was inconceivable. It was like, wow.
I know, it's good, isn't it? It's so surprising. So it just shows you the concept straight away. The concept of average gets thrown out the window.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's a very useful. You could actually use that tiny little snippet when if somebody's advocating for designing for the average.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now I don't know that was probably a 6 or 7 minute version of the story that I told at the start of the story. And if you were going, and it's probably worth illustrating to our listeners that you can take a story, they're almost infinitely compressible and expandable, and you can take that story and tell it very quickly.
Yes.
And so if somebody was going, well, we need to design for an average, you could say, well, look, back in the 1950s, the Air Force was looking at cockpit design, the US Air Force, and they took the measurements of 4,603 pilots, and they worked out the average against the 10 most important factors influencing cockpit design, right? And they came up with an average, right? So here's the average. And a young researcher came in and he thought, well, this isn't quite right. And so what it is he went, how many of those 4,603 pilots were within the average range on all 10 dimensions? And the answer was 0.
Yeah.
And then he said, okay, what about 3 dimensions? Only 3. And it was only 3.5%. So you might be saying we should design for the average, but maybe that example illustrates that we should think outside the box a little.
You know, just jumping to a totally side topic, but related, right? The body mass index, right?
Yep.
People talk about BMIs, and I hear people often will say, "Oh, yes, but it's not really accurate." But they don't go beyond that to explain. And the reason why it's not accurate is for the exact reason we're talking about here. It's kind of assuming some sort of average body shape, right? Which we've just seen doesn't exist. So if you sort of said to someone, look, BMI, that's not a really good indicator because quite frankly, there's not really an average sized body. I mean, they show this in the Air Force actually, and you could tell that little story and people would then go, he's right, BMI. Well, why would you do that? It's totally, sort of left of field. So anyway, there must be lots of things that assume average.
Yep.
Right. Be interested to hear from any of our listeners, things that they've come across that assume average. Something you can call into question.
So what about the concept of taking that longer story and telling it in the 60, 90 second version?
I think what you did there was really good lesson in a sense, because you focus in on the smaller event that still makes a lot of the point that you're making, right? Because when you tell the full, almost historical story, the 20s and the the wooden aircraft. That's interesting, but for making the point, you can still do it by just zooming in on the 1950s and this one single thing that happened with with that researcher that comes from Harvard.
Yeah, and it's important to still have a couple of specifics in there, like 1952, to say perhaps the name of the.
Well, that would be great,
researcher.
wouldn't it? Yeah,
Yeah,
because you do get a picture of them.
Yeah, and it adds credibility.
Yeah.
Instead of just going, oh, I heard this thing where the Air Force did the blah blah blah, which is pretty much easy to ignore. It's difficult to ignore when you go, well, look, 1952.
Yeah, that's it. That's what it comes down to, is the credibility.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's fantastic. But stories can do that. You can get the real crunch down version. Now, in terms of things that could make that story even better, I mean, now that you've told it a few times, is there anything that you're sort of hankering for to think, I would like to add that to the story, or things that you think just would make it a little stickier in some ways?
I think it's the same situation I've been in many times. It's a story that I really enjoyed, and I've listened to multiple versions of it, and there's a whole bunch of additional detail, and it's the stripping away that I've had to do most of, right? Getting rid of stuff.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Getting rid of it to get down to that version. Yeah. So that's something. There's so many things that I could add, and that, from having spent 20 years in the Air Force, that I'm interested in. But in terms of the story, I don't think would add much value.
Yeah.
I could have gone, the Gloucester Meteor, it's the first jet aircraft, and it was introduced in 1949. No. But doesn't really add value.
The only thing there's two things I think could help in my mind. And I think I've mentioned these types of things before, but one is a little thumbnail of what this lieutenant looked like.
Yeah. Right? I'm picturing a nerdy little guy.
Right. It'd be nice to know, is there a picture of him, and sort of like, and to be able to sort of say, yeah, I've seen a photo of him. He's just a wiry little fella with a beautifully coiffed moustache, or something like that. Don't know if they had moustaches in the Air Force back then. But the other thing is that the presentation of the insight, you could have done that as an imaginary meeting, right? Where you sort of said, so, he gathered together, the top brass, and he throws up his first slide. In fact, he doesn't click like this because, by the way, I'm clicking like a PowerPoint slide, but in fact, it would be an overhead sort of stencil that he would slide on the machine, I assume. And, I don't know. I wonder if that would just add a little bit of more visual, a visual element to this story. Makes it a little bit easier to see.
Yeah. And
just a thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. That would help make it more impactful. And of course, you have to do the imagine. That's the important bit.
Oh, yeah, you have to. And, as I was saying that, I was thinking, I wonder if they even had invented overhead projectors at that stage. Might have been slide projectors. I don't know. What do you have in the 50s?
But do you remember in 2006, Professor Brenda Dervin in I think it was 2006, we spent a day with her in Sydney, and it was the first time she'd ever used PowerPoint.
Is that right? I don't remember that. Did you really? So, he just passed away this year or last year.
Man, that's sad. She was a giant.
Yeah.
But I remember we were in that room that day, and she was struggling so much with PowerPoint, and she had one of her assistants with her who'd digitized, basically taken all of her transparencies and put them into PowerPoint. And after it was probably less than 90 minutes, she just went, no, we're not doing this anymore.
She was backing out.
And the assistant brought over, and she had this pile of transparencies that must have been, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches high.
Yeah.
It was, anyway.
That's good.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, for our listeners, she was an expert in sense making. That was her main topic, and just how do humans make sense of the world around them and the things that happen. She was, a great thought leader in that space.
I still remember something she said that day.
What was that?
Anger dissipates when people are listened to.
Right. Yeah, that's so true, isn't it?
Anyway, back to the story.
Yeah, tell me. Let's go to business points, right? So, what would you say are some of the business points you would?
Well, we've already covered a couple of them. The point that in this circumstance and possibly in many other circumstances, if you design for the average, you design for no one.
Yeah.
So that's a good one. It's the application I'm interested in. And one that really sticks on my mind is government policy and how ineffective government policy often is because it's designed for some sort of assumed average
citizen.
And it doesn't end up working for anyone.
I can imagine that would be the case. And the I'm kind of interested in this idea of the outsider giving new perspectives. It's not exactly the business point. It wouldn't be the direct business point, but it would be an sort of an additional business point you can make from that. Yeah.
Another one is be aware of your starting conditions.
Yes. That reminds me of, do you know that story about why we have the railway gauge, the width that it is? It comes from the horse and cart in Roman times, right? It was a certain width. And then, of course, they started building tunnels, for the horse and carts. And then next thing you know, they use the same roads, the same dimensions. And next thing you know, we have, cars and trains, which are essentially of that. Starting conditions are important, right?
Yeah.
They have a phenomenal long-term effect.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and so I guess that there's two ways. When you're at the start, be aware of the assumptions that you're making and the conditions that you're setting up. Yeah. And then when you're down the track, be aware that you might need to question the starting position.
Yeah. The thing is, it's so hard for the people who are involved, who've been around for a long time, to actually even see, the fact that the starting conditions have been perpetuated, right? So getting a new perspective, new eyes, all that sort of stuff, it's going to be important.
Yeah, and of course that's we've got a 23-year-old lieutenant who walks in with a completely fresh approach. So that reiterating the business point that you made earlier.
And it sounds like he was maybe an anthropology background. He'd been, Indiana Jones style down in jungle somewhere. I don't know. It sort of sounds like he was way out of that world that everyone else was in, I suppose. So got to find those characters.
And just being aware of groupthink, challenging your assumptions.
Yep.
It's got many applications.
I think so.
Many applications.
Okay. We're going to give it a score, though.
Yep.
I'm going to kick off, right? That's my job to kick off first, right?
It is. I told the story. You get to go first.
Okay, so I think it's because I'm attracted to this story from its potential for story-powered data that I'm going to give this an 8.5. I think this is a strong story that I can apply in a whole range of different areas. And the thing I want to do is actually get some graphs made, or maybe even find the original graphs of the 1950s and sort of see what they look like to show that insight of, how many people inside, what percentage inside the 10 characteristics, a big nutter. That would be great. So 8.5 for me. What are you giving it?
I'm going to give it a 7.5. No, in fact, no. I'm not even going to half. I'm not going to go halves. I'm going to go. For me, it's a 7.
Right.
It's a 7. Yep. It's a really good story. I really like it. I'll be using it. I'm going to put it in my story bank.
But you're only going to reel it out at dinner time. Is that what you're saying?
Well, actually, it might reel it out at dinner time. It's kind of an interesting thing to have at your back pocket for a dinner conversation. And I guess the complexity.
A bit harder to tell,
anyway,
right?
I think it's a
it comes with practice.
It's a 7.
Yeah, good.
And we'll make it easy, because in the show notes you'll be able to just copy and paste the entire thing. You'll be able to copy and paste the short version that we told, right? So easy to make it accessible in your story banks.
Yeah, very good. Well, I think this is the end of the show then. Unless we've got anything else to add.
Well, it's the end of this episode. I wouldn't.
Oh, okay. Yeah, big news. Big news. The end of the show. Thanks for listening in to Anecdotally Speaking, and tune in next week for another episode on how to put your stories to work. Bye now. Anecdotally Speaking was engineered by Dave Stokes from Author to Audio.